There you are, somewhere in the late 1300s. You've decided or been ordered to travel. Maybe you're a journeyman needing to present your craft in another town. Maybe you're a young pilgrim dreaming of reaching Canterbury. Or maybe you're just curious, which was a dangerous trait in medieval times. Regardless, you're about to learn that one of the first problems you'll face is this. You have no idea where you're going, and neither does anyone else. There are no GPS satellites overhead. No printed street signs. No handy apps giving you the fastest route. Avoid bandits. What you might have if you're unusually lucky or wealthy is a parchment map. But this map is not the kind you're imagining. No fine grid of roads. No legend in the corner, and definitely no scale. Instead, it's more of a spiritual and symbolic piece of artwork. The towns are drawn too large or too small. The distances between them aren't measured. They're guessed. A river might run straight through a city, or curl into itself like a snake, just because it looked nice that way. These maps were called mappamundi, Latin for maps of the world, but they weren't designed to get you from point A to point B. They were designed to show the relationship between heaven and earth, between the known and the feared. Jerusalem sat in the center as the spiritual heart of the world. The east, where the Garden of Eden supposedly still lingered, was always on top, and monsters roamed freely across the edges. If you were holding one of these maps, you'd be lucky to get out of your own village, much less arrive at another dock, so most travelers didn't use maps at all. They used something far less reliable, oral memory. Directions weren't written down. They were passed from mouth to mouth like a rumor. You might ask a local peasant at the edge of your village, which way to York? And he'd point vaguely toward the hills and say, follow the old Roman road past the burned oak, then turn left where the crows gather. And that was it. That was the instruction.now. That old Roman road might have been built 1,000 years ago and hasn't seen maintenance in centuries. It's not even always clear which track is the old road. Rain and time have erased its boundaries, turned cobblestones into puddles, and twisted the once straight path into multiple meandering trails. The burned oak might have collapsed 10 winters ago, and the crows, well, they gather in lots of places, especially near corpses. So good luck with that dot you set off anyway. You keep your bundle light, some bread, some hard cheese, a flask of something barely drinkable, and maybe a dagger, though, it won't help much. You try to stay on the dirt road, but very quickly that road becomes 2, then 3, then disappears into a marsh. You double back. You think you see wheel ruts. You follow them, they vanish. You ask a farmer plowing a field, but he speaks a different dialect than yours. You get the word north out of him, but you don't really know which way north is. The sun is behind a cloud. Your journey has only just begun, and already you are without a doubt lost. This confusion was part of the medieval experience. Most people were born, lived, and died within 5 to 10 miles of their village. That tiny patch of land was their entire world. Travel was rare and usually only done under religious obligation, trade necessity, or military demand. So even those giving directions didn't always know what lay beyond the next hamlet. They might offer instructions like, go down the road till you see the widow's barn, forgetting entirely that the barn burned 2 harvests ago. And the widow died of dysentery. For those who had a little education, monks, scribes, clerks there, were pilgrim itineraries, written records that listed places and how many days' walk they were from one another. But even these were inconsistent. Travel times changed depending on weather, the condition of the roads, and the number of tolls or contributions you had to pay to the local bandits. And if you were injured, sick, or old, that 2-day journey became a 5-day crawl. Some tried to follow religious trails, the road to Canterbury, the route to Santiago de Compostela. These were more established with the occasional marker or shrine along the way. But even then you had to trust strangers to keep you on the path. Monasteries sometimes helped. They might give you a basic idea of where to go next. Follow the stream until the 3rd bend, then climb the hill where the wind doesn't blow. Useful, but only if you're lucky. And if you're not, you end up in a town that isn't the one you meant to visit. You don't know anyone. You don't know the local customs. You might be fined for loitering, arrested for suspicion, or robbed before you can ask for help. If you're lucky, a kind soul will take pity and offer you a place in their barn. If not, you sleep in a ditch. What's strange to modern minds is how normal this was. People expected to get lost. Journeys took as long as they took. A trip from London to Paris might be planned in months, not days. Delays weren't just common. They were assumed. Lost travelers wandered into villages all the time, looking for food, asking for the way back to somewhere familiar. And sometimes they simply disappeared, eaten by the wilderness or swallowed by a war they didn't know was happening. All of this leads us to a strange truth. In the medieval world, getting lost wasn't a failure, it was a feature. Travel was unpredictable, filled with guesswork, miscommunication, and mistakes. But people went anyway because they had to. Pilgrims still walked thousands of miles. Merchants still risked the journey to trade goods. Messengers still rode across. Kingdoms with news that might already be outdated by the time it arrived. And somehow, through all of it, people kept moving. Not efficiently, not safely, but stubbornly. They tied charms to their belts, prayed to St. Christopher, and hoped the next town wasn't too far or too hostile dot. So when you imagine yourself in a medieval traveler's shoes, know this, you are not confidently striding forward with a clear path ahead. You are fumbling through half-heard directions, through forest and fog, asking the same question again and again. Is this the right way? And almost always the answer will be no. Let's return to your unfortunate journey across the medieval countryside. You've left your home village behind. You've gotten some directions, probably wrong ones from someone you barely understood. Maybe you're trying to follow the main road, if such a thing even exists. But here's the problem. In the medieval world, when someone said road, they didn't mean what you're picturing. There's no asphalt, no painted lines, no neat gravel shoulder, no signs every few miles reminding you what town is ahead. A medieval road, more often than not, was just a part of the land that had been trampled the most. A scar on the earth made by cartwheels, hooves, and human feet. Sometimes it looked like a trail, sometimes it looked like a swamp, and sometimes it simply vanished. Let's imagine you're walking along what you think is the main route between two towns. It's a wide, worn strip of land, maybe 2 or 3 men wide. That's promising. But almost immediately, the road dives into a forest. The branches above knit together like gnarled fingers, choking the light, casting everything in murky twilight even though it's the middle of the day. Roots push through the soil, turning your every step into a balancing act. Leaves cover any hint of a path, and now you can't tell where the actual road was. You walk for hours, squinting, hoping for a sign. Then suddenly the path forks. Neither direction looks travel. You stand there, you listen. The trees creak, crows laugh. You choose one. It feels like a mistake. That's what most of medieval travel felt like. A long, uneasy mistake. And then there's the mud. It isn't just a nuisance, it's an active hazard. Rain falls often and with little warning, without proper drainage, because no one really knew how to do that in rural areas. The water collects in the ruts left behind by ox carts and wagon wheels. Each rut becomes a miniature pond. Step into the wrong one, and your foot disappears to the shin. Your boot gets sucked off. Your bundle drops into the muck. You try to retrieve it. Now your hand's covered in something that isn't just mud. Because on this road, animals also travel. And where animals go, they leave behind ... reminders ... There were times when travelers could sink knee-deep in the mire, and in some notorious places like the infamous Fulmire Road in England, they might sink so deep they couldn't get out. These swampy passes became local legends. People told stories of carts swallowed whole, of horses that screamed and vanished into the earth. Sometimes travelers had to make the choice to abandon the road entirely and try cutting across a field, knowing full well that trespassing on a nobleman's land could get them fined, or worse. But staying on the road wasn't safe either. Roads were where you met bandits. Some of these bandits were Professionals, armed men, who lived in the woods and waited for the sound of hooves or wagon wheels before springing from the undergrowth. They didn't care if you were a poor pilgrim or a rich merchant. If you had anything worth taking, they'd take it. And if you didn't, well, they might take something else, just out of spite. Others weren't bandits in name, but they were no less dangerous. Local lords sometimes maintained their own private tolls, which wasn't always legal. You'd reach a bridge or a narrow pass and be stopped by a man with a spear who demanded a customary passage fee. If you refused, you might be turned away, roughed up, or worse. Soldiers returning from war sometimes turned to road robbery between campaigns. These were hardened men with battlefield experience and no income. And then there were the so-called protectors, guards, and patrolmen who offered protection for a price. Sometimes, these guards were worse than the robbers they claimed to defend against. And if you thought traveling in a group might help, think again. Bandits had no qualms attacking entire caravans. In fact, groups were often more tempting. A single traveler might not carry much. But a line of merchants with mules and carts, that looked like a feast. So where does this leave you? You're lost, probably tired, feet soaked, navigating a road that shifts constantly beneath your boots. You might stumble upon a ford, a place where the road crosses a river. There's no bridge, just a shallow crossing, supposedly. But when you step in, you realize the river's swelled from last night's rain. The current grabs at your legs. You slip, your pack is soaked again. You drag yourself out, shivering, only to find you've now crossed into someone's field. And a shepherd is eyeing you with suspicion. What's worse, in some areas, roads split apart into false trails, branches, made by years of travelers taking slightly different routes to avoid puddles or hills or threats. These eventually formed parallel tracks that meandered in opposite directions. Some might loop back to the main path. Others led straight into the woods and vanished forever. It was possible to follow one of these for days before realizing you'd gone completely in the wrong direction. And don't forget about road maintenance, or rather, the lack of it. There was no Department of Transportation, no routine inspections. If a road was damaged by a storm or overgrown with brambles, it just stayed that way until someone, usually a desperate local peasant, cleared it. Sometimes monasteries or local guilds took it upon themselves to maintain bits of road nearby. But these efforts were piecemeal and inconsistent. A good stretch might lull you into confidence, only for the next mile to fall apart into a bog filled with biting flies and mosquitoes. Even worse were the boundary. Routes that marked the edge between one feudal territory and the next. No one wanted to claim responsibility for them. These places often became neglected, lawless zones perfect for ambushes, disappearances, and ghost stories. Travelers often hurried through these areas in silence, gripping whatever weapon they had, eyes darting to every rustling leaf. And when night fell, forget about making more progress. You couldn't keep walking unless the moon was full and the sky was clear. Otherwise, you stopped, huddled in your cloak by the side of the road, listening for footsteps that weren't your own. Even if you found a village, you might not be allowed in. Town gates closed at sunset. Strangers were viewed with suspicion, especially those arriving after dark. You might be mistaken for a thief or a spy. Or worse, a leper. This is the great irony of medieval travel. The road was both your only way forward and your greatest enemy. It offered a promise of progress, of getting somewhere, but it was never straightforward. It twisted and turned, vanished, and reappeared, betrayed and abandoned you. It was an untrustworthy companion, and the further you traveled, the more uncertain everything became. Accents shifted. Customs changed. A traveler from Devon might not understand. Merchant from Kent. A Norman soldier passing through Sussex might be greeted with cold stares or drawn swords. Even the shape of buildings, the structure of farm plots, the styles of clothing, everything shifted subtly from region to region, so that by the time you arrived at your destination, you weren't just physically exhausted. You were mentally frayed, disoriented, unsure of where you were or whether you'd even arrived at the right place. All because the road, that lifeline of movement, was never really a road. It was a gamble, a guess, a barely visible trail through an indifferent world. Sometimes dry, often wet, sometimes quiet, often dangerous. And through it all, you kept walking because there was no alternative. The world was big and unfriendly, and to stop moving was to surrender. So you trudged on, mud-soaked, blistered, half lost and half hopeful through the endless uncertainty of the medieval road. You've walked for days now. The road has tried to kill you twice, tricked you 3 times, and soaked you thoroughly more often than you can count. You've climbed hills you didn't need to climb, wandered into bogs that weren't on any map, if you even had a map to begin with, and shared a ditch with a dying mule. You've earned every mile with blisters and bad bread. And you might think, perhaps naively, that things would improve if anyone was in charge of the roads. Someone to set rules. Someone to enforce safety. Someone to ensure the road stayed in one place and didn't turn into a swamp or a thieves' paradise every few miles. But here's the medieval answer to that hope. No one is in charge. Not really. Not all the time. And never when you need them. Medieval. Europe was a mosaic hundreds, sometimes thousands, of overlapping jurisdictions with each patch of land claimed by someone different. A king here, a duke there, a bishop somewhere else. But these titles meant little when it came to maintaining roads, especially the ones winding through forests, up hills, or across windswept plains. A royal charter might declare a road safe for travel, but a charter doesn't build bridges. It doesn't drain puddles. It doesn't scare away bandits. And it doesn't tell the wandering peasant where to turn when the trail forks. The Roman Empire, long gone by this point, had once been a master of roads. They carved their highways through Europe like veins, straight and deliberate. Some of these roads survived. You might still find yourself walking a Roman route, though time, weather, and abandonment have left them cracked, broken, and buried beneath centuries of mud and moss. Still, their bones remain, but the organization that once cared for them, that's gone. What remains is feudalism, and feudalism has very little patience for things like public infrastructure. Under the feudal system, land was divided and subdivided endlessly. Kings granted huge swaths of territory to powerful nobles in exchange for loyalty and military support. Those nobles carved up their holdings further, distributing land to knights, and vassals who might in turn allow peasants to farm small plots. Each of these landholders had responsibilities, usually collecting taxes, raising soldiers, and keeping their own manors in order, but maintaining roads between settlements. Not their problem. You could walk a single road for a day and pass through a dozen jurisdictions. Each lord had authority over his portion, and each had a different idea of what that meant. One might try to maintain the road through tolls, hiring a few men to fill holes and cut brush. The next might see tolls as pure profit and do nothing at all. Another might forbid travelers altogether, unless they had his personal approval. Still, another might allow anyone to pass, so long as they paid a tax, swore an oath, or dropped off a gift for his guards. There was no consistency. No standard signs. No central records. You were expected to know these things, to understand who ruled what, which banners flew over which hilltops, and what behaviors might get you arrested or chased away. This knowledge didn't come from school. It came from gossip, rumor, and hard-earned experience. And even when you knew the name of the local authority, you couldn't always rely on them. Lords weren't always present. Many spent their time in larger towns or at royal courts, far from their own lands. Their local representatives, bailiffs, or minor knights were often corrupt or indifferent. They were there to extract taxes and enforce order, not to make your journey easier. So if you were robbed on a road that ran through a noble's land, there was rarely any help. You could complain at the nearest manor. You might be allowed to speak to the bailiff, assuming you weren't chased off as a beggar, but justice, compensation, unlikely. You weren't a resident. You weren't one of the Lord's men. You were a nobody on a road that belonged to no one. Even religious authorities, bishops, abbots, priors controlled land. Some maintained routes leading to pilgrimage sites or monasteries. These might be better cared for with way stations or hospices along the way, but these efforts were usually limited to a few miles. Once you passed the monastery's reach, the road reverted to whatever condition the next landholder allowed. And the church, vast as it was, did not operate as a unified infrastructure agency. Each abbey had its own priorities, its own resources, and its own views on whether travelers deserved comfort or penance. And then, of course, there were the towns. Walled, guarded, and sometimes helpful, towns had more resources than most manors. They had guilds, councils, even rudimentary laws. Some cities tried to manage the roads within a short radius, especially those critical for trade. But even then, their control was limited. A town might repair a road leading to its gates, but it couldn't force a neighboring lord to maintain the next stretch. Disputes over roads, who owned them, who taxed them, who was allowed to pass, were constant. In many places, travelers simply had to negotiate access as they moved. This might involve paying tolls, offering gifts, or even pledging service. Some roads were closed entirely during certain seasons. Others were restricted based on your class, religion, or accent. A traveling merchant from a distant city might be turned away from a village because the locals didn't trust outsiders. A lone woman might be denied shelter. A pilgrim might be told to wait until a feast day passed or a local conflict ended. Worse still, there was no consensus on legality. If you were robbed, assaulted, or falsely imprisoned, the outcome depended entirely on where it happened and who was nearby. Some regions had traveling judges or royal officials who moved from place to place, hearing cases and imposing order. But these visits were rare, sometimes occurring only once every few years. The rest of the time, local justice prevailed. That usually meant no justice at all for strangers. This chaos wasn't seen as a problem. It was the normal order. People didn't expect roads to be safe. They didn't expect fair treatment. Most people never left their home region precisely. Because of these uncertainties, the only people who braved it regularly were those who had to: merchants, messengers, pilgrims, soldiers. And even they traveled with a deep and constant awareness that each step forward was a risk, dot to complicate things further. Wars could erupt at any time, anywhere. Borders between kingdoms and duchies weren't just imaginary lines. They were volatile flashpoints. A road that was safe 1 month could fall under enemy control the next. Armies trampled paths into mud, destroyed bridges, looted towns, and conscripted travelers. You might be accused of spying simply for carrying a letter, or arrested because your accent resembled that of the wrong side. Even natural landmarks changed meaning depending on who was in charge. A bridge might be a public crossing 1 year, and a guarded checkpoint the next. A river ford could be closed off, taxed, or defended with a barricade. And since so few people could read or write, these changes were not published anywhere. You learned them the hard way, or from others who'd been through it and survived. The only real constant was uncertainty. Every time you crossed a boundary, you entered someone else's rules. And those rules could shift again without warning. One man's road was another man's trap. One town's guest was another town's intruder. And so, as a medieval traveler, you moved through a landscape of fragmented authority, where no one, not the king, not the church, not the lords, could guarantee your safety or your progress. The road was a collection of borrowed permissions, tolerated habits, and shaky assumptions. You were never really welcome. You were never really protected, and you were always on your own dot so far. You faced mud, madness, and misrule. The road beneath your feet has betrayed you. The lords around you have ignored you. And now, as you wander into yet another unfamiliar hamlet, soaked to the knees and covered in a layer of something that probably isn't just soil, you have a desperate hope. Perhaps someone knows the way. Perhaps there's a person, a local, a traveler, a guide who can offer some real help. But this is medieval Europe. The notion of a reliable travel guide belongs to a future that hasn't yet arrived. The person waiting to give you directions, more often than not there, about to lead you entirely astray. Let's begin with the very idea of the guide. In the modern world, we imagine a guide as a professional, someone trained, certified, familiar with routes, languages, local customs. In the medieval world, a guide was often just whoever happened to have gone that way once. Maybe they were a pilgrim who'd returned from a shrine. Maybe they were a merchant with a vague memory of a trade fair 2 winters ago. Maybe they were just the only person in town who could point with confidence, even if their confidence wasn't entirely matched by accuracy that most people peasants. Farmers, even lesser nobles, had never traveled more than a few miles from their home. Their understanding of geography was shaped by rumor, hearsay, and poorly remembered stories passed down through generations. A guide might say, "Oh yes, York is 3 days north," when it's actually a week northeast. Or they might say, "Follow the river until you see the split oak." But forget to mention that the split oak fell down 5 years ago and now lies hidden beneath underbrush and moss dot, and then there were the ones who lied on purpose. Sometimes it was harmless. Locals would amuse themselves by sending travelers in circles. Turn left at the old stone and walk till your feet ache, then turn right past the field of sheep. The field has no sheep. The stone is a mile out of sight, and your feet were aching before you even asked Dot other times. The lies were cruel. A merchant rival might mislead a competitor on purpose. A jealous farmer might send a newcomer into the swamps. A stranger asking too many questions could be sent in the direction of accursed woods or a hostile village. And remember, many guides, especially in inns or taverns, gave their advice after a few mugs of ale. Even if they meant well, their memory might be cloudy. Their sense of distance warped by fatigue and time. Of course, some guides were offered for hire. A few coins could get you someone willing to walk beside you, perhaps lead your mule, maybe help carry a bundle. But these so-called professionals were no more reliable. Many were desperate peasants looking to earn coin however they could. Others were opportunistic thieves, offering to guide you only to steer you straight into an ambush. Some simply took your coin, led you 10 miles in the wrong direction, and disappeared in the night. Even monks, who were among the most literate and widely traveled people of the period, could be deeply unhelpful. A monk might direct you based on the location of a now defunct abbey, or describe the road as it was during their journey 30 years prior. Monastic maps were often theological, not practical. They knew the way to Jerusalem, but not to the next village over dot, and when you finally did stumble upon someone who had truly been where you wanted to go, someone who could perhaps describe a crossing or a village, you still had to deal with medieval units of measurement. People didn't speak in miles or kilometers. They spoke in days. "It's 2 days to Canterbury," they'd say, which might mean 20 miles if you were young, strong, and well-fed. Or it might mean 10 if the road was bad. Or 30 if the speaker had a horse and you did not. There were no standards. A day's journey. It was just however far you could get before night fell. And you gave up dot. There were also the pilgrim itineraries, handwritten texts listing the stops along sacred routes, sometimes with rough estimates of the distances between holy sites. If you were headed to a place like Santiago de Compostela or Canterbury, and you had access to a monastery or a literate companion, you might consult one of these. But the entries were often sparse. They assumed you knew the local terrain, and they didn't always reflect current conditions. A road that was passable last season might now be underwater. A town listed on the route might have been abandoned due to plague. A shrine might have been sacked, its roads overgrown, and even these rare bits of written guidance were almost completely inaccessible to the average traveler. Most people couldn't read, and those who could read Latin weren't usually the ones doing the walking. Pilgrims and poor folk relied entirely on others, monks, tavern keepers, fellow travelers, to offer updates. Most of what passed for guidance was storytelling, not instruction. One pilgrim would say, "When I went, I saw a fox by the well and heard the bells of the shrine," and that would become the marker you looked for. You might listen to 3 or 4 stories and try to stitch together a route from fragments. And faith. Sometimes you might meet someone who had drawn a map. These weren't standardized either. Everyone had their own style. Some looked like childish doodles. Hills were triangles. Rivers were squiggles. Towns were represented by little churches or clusters of dots. Roads were simple lines often, with no indication of direction, distance, or what hazards you might encounter. Some maps were drawn from memory, others copied from someone else's, errors compounded quickly. And if you asked the guide what the strange mark meant on the path between 2 dots, they might say, "Oh, that's where the old woman cries at night." Not exactly useful information for a traveler trying to avoid robbers. And still, despite all of this, despite the misleading tailies, the crooked advice, the lazy guesswork travelers kept asking. Because what choice did they have? The world was vast, unmarked, and uncertain. Asking a guide, even a bad one, was often better than walking completely blind. Sometimes a fellow traveler might take pity on you. A tinker, a friar, a wandering minstrel. They'd walked the roads more than most and might know a safer crossing or a good innkeeper. They might walk with you for a time, share a crust of bread, point to a distant hill, and say, "See that ridge? Follow it until you see a church steeple. That's Ashwell. Stay the night there. Tell them the blind piper sent you." And somehow that would be enough. Or close to it. But even these guides couldn't save you from the randomness of travel. A helpful man might say, "Take the west road, the one with the mossy stones. But forget that 2 other roads look exactly the same. Or that the moss had grown over all of them. Or that the west road had recently collapsed in a landslide." You were always, in the end, one bad turn from disaster got in this way. Medieval travel was not just a physical challenge. It was a mental one. You had to remember every detail. A rock shaped like a bird. A tree that bent to the left. A stream that sang louder near dusk. You had to listen carefully, memorize quickly, and hope the person guiding you wasn't too drunk, too tired, or too proud to admit they had no idea what they were talking about. And maybe that's the most medieval thing of all. A culture built on uncertain memories, oral folklore, and half-believed truths. People helped one another not because they had a duty, but because that was how they survived. Travelers shared information like coins, passing it along, embellishing it, sometimes inventing it because stories were all they had. Roads weren't mapped. They were remembered, badly dot, so as you sit at the edge of the tavern bench, sipping something that tastes like wood-smoked vinegar and trying to figure out whether to trust the one-eyed stablehand who claims he knows. Shortcut over the hills. Just remember this. Everyone in this room is making it up as they go. The guide might lead you true. Or he might lead you in circles, then vanish at dawn. Either way, you'll keep walking. Because that's what travelers did, even when they had no real guide at all. You've made it another day down the path, if one can call it that. Your feet are raw. Your cloak smells like wet leaves and sheep. You've trusted strangers, followed bad advice. And now, just as the road begins to level out into something almost walkable, you start to feel it, that heaviness behind your eyes. That slow ache in your gut. That quiet scratch at the back of your throat that tells you, with ancient certainty, you are getting sick. Not a little sick. Not I'll walk it off sick. But medieval sick. Which is different because in the Middle Ages, getting sick wasn't an inconvenience. It wasn't a delay. It was a gamble with your life the medieval traveler lived at. The mercy of things too small to see, too strong to resist, and too misunderstood to be managed. Germs had not yet entered the picture. The word bacteria had never been spoken. The theory of disease boiled down to a chaotic mess of humors, bad air, sinful behavior, and vague celestial misalignments. And on the road where everything was uncertain and exposure was constant, the odds of falling ill were never far behind you. They walked beside you, silently, waiting for the right moment to strike. Let's begin with the most basic necessity. Water. You need to drink. But from where? The stream at the edge of the woods looks clean enough. The water trickles over stones, cool and inviting. But upstream, just out of view, someone has been washing their laundry, or their ox, or their dead relative. Worse, a whole village may be dumping their chamber pots into it because there's no other drainage. Medieval sanitation, if we can call it that, was charmingly indifferent to contamination. Water sources were communal, unfiltered, and often shared by animals, humans, and corpses alike. Even wells, precious as they were, weren't always safe. If the well had a cracked lining or was too close to a privy, it could leach in filth from the surrounding ground. Some villages even built their privies uphill from their wells, not out of malice, but from ignorance and convenience. And so, with every sip you take from a questionable bucket, you're gambling with diseases you've never heard of. Dysentery, cholera, typhoid. Then there's the ale. People drank ale because it was often safer than water. The brewing process killed off some of the harmful microbes, and the alcohol content, though mild, helped preserve it a little longer. But not all ale was created equal. On the road, you couldn't afford the good stuff. You drank whatever the locals brewed. And local ale could mean anything from a properly fermented barley brew to something that tasted and looked like wet bread mixed with mold. Some ale was half fermented, still bubbling with live yeast. Some had been sitting in the corner of an inn for weeks, growing stranger by the hour. Some was thinned out with ditch water to stretch a profit. And still, you drank it because you were thirsty and it was all there was. But it didn't always stay down. Many a traveler found themselves doubled over behind a hedge, emptying their stomachs into the very land they were trying to cross. But water and ale were only the beginning. The food, too, was a minefield. You might stop at a wayside inn and order whatever's cooking. Pottage, probably a stew made from yesterday's leftovers, and the day before's, and possibly last week's if times were hard. It's a bubbling grayish slop made of grain, onions, roots, and the occasional shred of meat. But what kind of meat? That's a question you learn not to ask. Rat? Rabbit? Something that died yesterday and smelled odd this morning, but was too valuable to throw out. It's hard to say. Preservation was rudimentary at best. Salt was used when available, but it was expensive. Smoking helped, though not always effectively. Drying was useful, but inconsistent, and refrigeration. The closest thing was burying food underground or storing it in cool cellars, both of which came with their own problems, including mold, insects, and rodents. Spoiled food was a part of life. Travelers often ate things that made them sick, not because they were careless, but because there were no alternatives, and then came the illnesses themselves along. Slow parade of misery that accompanied almost every journey. There was the ever-reliable dysentery, also known as the bloody flux, a charming condition that involved cramps, fever, and a constant, desperate need to be near a bush. If you caught it, and you were lucky, you might recover after a week of weakness and dehydration. If you weren't lucky, you could lose so much fluid that your body simply gave up. Then there was fever of unknown origin. Medieval people described it in many ways: hot head, burning blood, the ague, but they couldn't cure it. A traveler might go to bed feeling tired and wake up burning with heat, their body soaked in sweat, their mind drifting in and out of clarity. Physicians might recommend bloodletting, or the application of leeches, or herbal concoctions with names like wormwood tonic or mercury balm. Sometimes they even prescribed vomiting on purpose, as though emptying the body would rid it of evil. Spoiler, it didn't. Some travelers developed rashes. Some coughed up blood. Others found their limbs swelling, their eyes yellowing, their breathing labored. Malaria, now mostly tropical, once haunted parts of Europe's marshlands. A simple mosquito bite could end your journey. In summer, flies carried disease from dung heaps to bread crusts in minutes. In winter, frostbite could turn a sore toe into a blackened stump. In any season, lice and fleas made themselves at home under cloaks and collars, feeding silently, leaving behind irritation and infection. And of course, there was plague that it didn't always strike, but when it did, it moved fast. A traveler unknowingly carrying fleas might pass through a village and leave death behind him. And the reverse was just as true. You might arrive in a bustling town only to find it strangely quiet. Doors closed, windows shuttered, the air too still. And then you'd hear the sound of a bell, or a cart, or a scream. Plague wasn't just a disease. It was a force, a presence, something that settled in places like a fog. Travelers who realized they'd entered a plague zone often tried to flee, but by then, it was often too late. The infection clung to your skin, your belongings, the very breath in your lungs. And once sick, where could you go? There were no hospitals, not in a modern sense. Monasteries sometimes took in the sick, but only if you were deemed pious or worthy. Villages feared outsiders with coughs or blotchy skin. You might be denied entry, run out of town, or quietly buried behind a hedge. Even if you found shelter, there were no real cures. A local healer might offer herbs, nettle tea, elderflower, crushed garlic. They might burn incense, wave charms, mutter prayers. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. Often, the best medicine was rest, clean water, and warmth, none of which were easy to find on the road, and so medieval travelers carried not just sacks and bundles, but a burden of risk. Every sip, every bite, every handshake, every shared bench. These were all invitations to illness. There were no guarantees, no sterile rooms, no safety nets. Just the hope that your body could endure a little more discomfort without giving in. And as you lay beneath a damp tree, shivering, with fever, your stomach a battlefield of bad ale and spoiled stew, you might finally understand why so few people left home. Travel wasn't adventure. It was survival, and when the sun rose again and you pulled your aching body to its feet, you knew you'd do it anyway. Because there was still a long road ahead and no one to carry you but yourself. You've heard the bells, you've seen the worn wooden staffs. You've watched them pass on the road, walking slowly in groups, cloaks flapping, faces turned down. Pilgrims. From a distance, they look like hopeful figures, pious, determined, peaceful. But if you follow their footsteps, if you walk with them for even a day, you'll quickly realize the truth. A medieval pilgrimage was not a spiritual vacation. It was not a pleasant stroll toward holiness. It was a long, punishing, exhausting ordeal, somewhere between a chaotic religious procession and an unpaid military march without armor to begin with. Why did people go on pilgrimage at all? There were many reasons. Some went to fulfill religious vows. Others hoped to be healed of diseases or forgiven for sins. Many were sent by priests as a form of penance walk to Canterbury. They were told, or Santiago or Rome, and your soul might be saved. And some just went because they had nothing left, no land, no family, no future, and pilgrimage was a way to start over, or to at least be somewhere else. But no matter the reason, the road was the same, difficult, dangerous, and deeply disorganized. Pilgrims had no special travel privileges. They walked the same muddy roads, slept in the same ditches, drank from the same questionable streams. The only difference was that they wore signs of their purpose. Some carried wooden badges shaped like a shell or a cross. Some had long staffs or wore simple robes. Many carried letters of introduction, pilgrim credentials of sorts from their priests. But none of these offered protection from weather, theft, or illness. Bandits did not care if your pouch held scripture or silver, and neither did wolves. The journey itself often began with nothing but blind faith. Few pilgrims had maps. Most couldn't read. They followed word of mouth, rumors, and local traditions. Take the left road, someone might say. Follow the stream past the ruined mill. Avoid the woods, they say a man with no eyes lives there. Pilgrimage routes became networks of half-truths and scattered knowledge, marked more by legend and direction. Some routes were more formal. The road to Canterbury, the way of St. James, the road to Rome. These paths had been traveled for generations. Towns along the way grew accustomed to the wandering faithful and sometimes offered shelter. But even on these roads, the journey was never smooth. Weather was a constant adversary. Pilgrims walked in sun and storm alike, A sudden downpour could turn the road into a river. A snowstorm could bury the way completely. Cloaks offered little. Warmth, boots if they had them, leaked. And the cold could turn spiritual reflection into quiet, bone-deep suffering. Food was unreliable. Some towns offered pilgrim bread-hard, dark loaves of barley or rye. But supplies were limited. Pilgrims often begged for scraps or relied on the kindness of monasteries. They shared dried peas, onions, garlic, maybe some cheese if they were lucky. When they couldn't find food, they walked hungry. Shelter was a luxury. Some found space. In hospices, simple structures set up by the church to house the faithful, but these were small and few. On crowded routes, space ran out quickly. Many slept on straw in barns, under trees, or against the side of a stone wall. Some pilgrims carried nothing but a sack, a spoon, and a blanket, and yet they kept going. They walked through strange towns, speaking unfamiliar dialects. They walked past lepers, through battle-scarred lands, and into the territories of hostile lords. Some were taxed or turned away. Others were robbed. And still others were mistaken for criminals, because in the Middle Ages, wandering poor people, no matter their reason, were always under suspicion. Group travel offered some protection. Pilgrims formed temporary brotherhoods on the road bands, of strangers united by mutual exhaustion. They watched out for one another, shared bread, took turns sleeping, helped carry the weak. But even these bands were fragile. A quarrel, a theft, a misplaced word, and the group might break apart. And then you'd be alone again. And then there were the scams. The road to holiness was littered with lies. Fake relics were sold at roadside. Shrines. This, a man might say, holding up a splinter of wood, is from the true cross. Or these bones belong to St. Jerome's cat. Pilgrims were desperate. They bought tokens, charms, blessed pins, tiny bottles of holy water, many of which were nothing more than river water and carved wood. Some guides promised shortcuts for coin, only to vanish. Some innkeepers charged a blessing fee, or offered pilgrim stew made from whatever they could scrape together. But the cruelest deception was often at the destination. After weeks, or even months on the road, a pilgrim might arrive at the shrine hungry, sick, clothes torn, hope fading, and find the doors closed, or the relic moved, or the town demanding a donation just to enter the sanctuary. And even when the relic was present, when the candles were lit and the bells rang out, there was no guarantee of healing, no assurance of grace. A prayer offered was all they had, and weary body to carry back home, because getting there was only half the journey. Many pilgrims died on the return trip, from disease, from exhaustion, from wounds that never healed. Their bodies were buried on the road in mass graves or shallow pits, marked by crude crosses or forgotten entirely. The lucky ones were found by monks and given last rites. The unlucky were stripped by thieves before their souls had even left. And still more came. Pilgrimage was an act of desperation, of devotion, of escape. But above all, it was a test of endurance, a slow march through mud, hunger, and doubt. Some walked with joy. Others wept, most simply endured. Because in the end, walking was the only thing they could control. And so the road to salvation became, for many, a quiet kind of torment. And yet, they kept walking, one foot in front of the other, into the dusk, because what else could they do? There are many enemies on the medieval road: hunger, disease, bandits, confusion, but one of the most persistent, most unavoidable, and most personally vindictive is the weather. Not just bad weather, not just inconvenient or unpredictable weather. No, what you encounter on the road is a kind of weather that seems to know who you are and actively wants to see you suffer. To travel in medieval times was to walk beneath a sky that did not care for your plans. There were no weather forecasts, no barometers, no maps with swirling arrows telling you when to expect rain. There were clouds and your own poor judgment. And maybe an old shepherd who squinted at the horizon and said something vague like, "Sheep's restless today." That was your forecast, and yet you stepped outside anyway. Let us begin with rain, because rain is always waiting. Sometimes it starts as a fine mist enough to dampen your hair, to turn dust into paste, to fog your vision with a constant sheen. Other times it comes suddenly, like an ambush from the sky. One moment you're walking with a bit of optimism, maybe even humming. The next, the heavens open like a bucket tipping over, and within seconds your clothes are soaked through to the skin. Cloaks help at first, but they get wet too, and stay wet. They hold the water in like a sponge. It clings to your shoulders and drips down your back. Your shoes begin to squelch. The road dissolves into brown muck, and what was once a path becomes a treacherous soup of footprints, puddles, and slick stones. And then there's the cold dot. It seeps in quietly, without ceremony. Not the dramatic cold of snowstorms or howling winds, but the quiet, damp chill that clings to your bones and never quite leaves. It arrives when the rain stops, when you're just wet enough to be miserable but not soaked enough to justify. Fire. Your fingers ache. Your breath puffs out in ghostly wisps. The sun, if it appears at all, feels like a rumor dot. You keep walking, and then comes the wind, which is not merely unpleasant, it's cruel. It pushes against you like an invisible hand, dragging your cloak behind you, drying your eyes, slicing at your ears and cheeks. It finds every gap in your clothing, slips inside, and rattles your bones like a child shaking a toy. You wrap your arms around yourself, you hunch, you curse, but the wind does not care. It laughs through the trees, knocks over your walking stick, and whips the smoke of your little fire directly into your face. Sometimes the wind carries dust. Other times, ice. In open fields, it comes unchallenged. In forests, it whistles like a warning. On hilltops, it tries to throw you off entirely. And always it is louder than your thoughts. But the worst, perhaps, is the heat, not tropical. Heat, not desert heat. Just long, muggy, inescapable medieval summer. The kind where the sun sits just overhead and watches you like a cat with a mouse. You sweat until your clothes cling to you. Your water runs out. Your mouth becomes dry then, sticky, then raw. There's no breeze. There's no shade. Only flies. Always flies thought they follow you. Buzz around your head. Land on your face. Your skin itches from sweat and dirt and bites. The road smells of heat-baked dung and rotting things. You try to think of cooler places, but your brain refuses. You have walked for hours and feel no closer to your destination. Your feet feel swollen. Your face burns. You wonder if you're still walking straight dot, and then come the storms. Sudden, biblical, theatrical. A hot wind picks up. Clouds roll in. The world darkens. You see lightning in the distance and count 1, 2, 3, until the thunder arrives, like the earth itself is splitting open. Your feet slip on the wet. Stones. Trees sway violently. If you're on open ground, you panic. If you're in the forest, branches crash down around you. Rain hammers your face sideways. You crouch behind something, anything, and hope the lightning doesn't find you. When it ends, you're not relieved. You're just wet again, tired, shaking, and now everything you own smells like mildew dot in winter. It only gets worse. Snow isn't romantic here. It's a hazard. Paths disappear. Landmarks vanish. The world turns white and quiet and deeply, bitterly cold. You wrap yourself in every piece of cloth you own, but it's not enough. Your fingers go numb. Then they hurt. Then they go numb again. You sleep if you can, huddled against a tree or pressed into a sheep pen, with frost clinging to your beard and toes like slow, frozen teeth. You dream of warmth and wake to silence, and when you rise, your legs feel like stone. You try to move and pain shoots through your joints. You're not dead. But you're close. Even when the weather isn't actively attacking you, it finds ways to disrupt your plans. Fog rolls in and blinds you. Dew makes the road slippery. Sudden gusts blow out your only candle. Hail strikes your forehead like thrown rocks. The sun dazzles you just as you reach a crossroads, and you can't see which way to turn dot. And all of this, there's no shelter dot, no inns around every bend. No cabins waiting in the woods. Sometimes you find a stable and beg to sleep with. The animals. Sometimes you crawl beneath a hedge. Sometimes you dig a little hollow into a hill and curl into it like a fox. You dream of a fire, but wood is wet, your flint gone, or the wind won't let it catch. Even monasteries, known for their charity, might turn you away in bad weather. The sick, the dying, and the frostbitten fill their halls. There's no room, you're not local. You're told to try the next town. It's only 8 miles, someone says. You nod, you begin walking again, and it rains again. The weather on the medieval road was not your companion. It wasn't neutral. It was a force that seemed to notice you, and once it noticed you, it never let go. You could survive a bandit attack. You could survive bad bread, but you could not outwalk the sky that it followed you from one day to the next. And it changed never in your favor. And so every traveler, whether a merchant or pilgrim or peasant, learned the same lesson. The road does not welcome you, and the sky actively resents you. You've been walking since dawn. Your legs feel like wood. Your eyes sting from wind and dust. The last bread you ate was dry and covered in something that might have been flour or might have been fungus. Your water is gone. Your boots are soaked. And the sun has finally started to dip beneath the tree line. It's time to stop, to rest, to find shelter, to close your eyes for just a little while and not be walking anymore. But this is medieval Europe, and the night is not your friend. But finding a place to sleep on the road wasn't just a challenge. It was a gamble. Every evening brought a new roll of the dice. Would you find a bed? A roof? A stable? A pile of straw? Would you sleep in a barn beside pigs? Would you be welcomed into a stranger's hut? Or would you curl into the ditch beside? The road, trying to pretend that the rock under your shoulder wasn't bruising your ribs? There were no hotels, no reliable inns every few miles. In the countryside, lodging was inconsistent at best. Villages were scattered, sometimes a day's walk apart, and even when you found one, there was no guarantee they'd take you in. You were a stranger. You might be a thief, or a beggar, or bring disease, and villagers were wary. They had little to offer even each other, much less a ragged man from nowhere. If you had coin silver, preferably, not the lowly copper that jingled like false hope, you might try your luck at an inn. These weren't grand buildings. Most were just taverns or alehouses with a few beds upstairs, or straw pallets in a corner. You'd pay your fee too much, always too much, and be granted a spot. Not a room, a spot, a piece of floor, a shared bench, a mattress with other travelers already snoring upon it. Privacy didn't exist. You might sleep beside a tanner with bad breath, a peddler with lice, and a drunk monk who talked in his sleep. The air was thick with sweat and beer and something you didn't want to identify. Someone always snored. Someone always coughed. Someone always muttered to themselves in the dark. And then there were the creatures. Beds, when they existed, were not clean. Mattresses were stuffed with straw or rags, rarely changed, never washed. And from those dark seams came your true companions, bedbugs. Small, relentless, invisible in the dark, they feasted on your skin with silent glee. You would waken in the middle of the night itching, slapping at your arms, unsure whether you were being bitten or simply going mad from the pressure of your journey. Fleas were also common. So were lice. Once they arrived, they stayed. In your blanket, in your cloak, in your hair. You could try to burn them out, wash in a stream, comb through your tunic with a knife. But they always came back, and then there were rats, big ones. Bold ones. They skittered across rafters, sniffed at your sack while you slept, nibbled at crusts beside your head. One might even try to crawl into your blanket for warmth. You could, swat it away, but it would return. They always did. If you couldn't afford an inn or couldn't find one, you'd start asking around. Any place to sleep? Some villagers might direct you to a barn. If the farmer was generous, you might be allowed to sleep in the straw beside the oxen. The warmth was a blessing. The smell was strong, but tolerable. The floor was uneven. The mice were active, but at least it was dry. And no one bothered you unless the farmer changed his mind and sent you out in the middle of the night, grumbling. about thieves and curses. Sometimes you'd sleep under a cart, using its frame as a windbreak. Sometimes in an abandoned shed, roof leaking, corners damp, insects claiming the walls. And sometimes, too often, you slept in the open, in a field, by a hedge, in a notch of a ditch. You tuck your cloak around yourself, curl against the cold, and try not to think about wolves. Or thieves. Or the church bells tolling in the distance, reminding you how far you still had to go. Even places that were meant to help. Monasteries and hospices weren't always reliable. Monasteries were supposed to offer shelter to travelers. It was a sacred duty, and some did. You might be given bread. A bowl of thin broth. A wooden bunk in a cold room where the only decoration was a crucifix and a draft. But monasteries were few and far between. And they often had rules. You had to arrive before sunset. You had to be sober. You had to carry a pilgrim's token or a note from your priest, or simply not look too ragged. And even if they took you, and they might send you away at dawn with no more food. And no more sympathy. Hospices, especially those on pilgrimage routes, were small, overburdened, and often filled with the truly ill, dying men with fevers. Women with festering wounds. The air inside was thick with the scent of rot and candle wax and desperation. You could sleep there, yes, but you might not wake up in better health. Sometimes. Fellow travelers offered shelter. A merchant might let you share his tent. A tinker might build a small fire and welcome your company. These were the lucky nights, the rare moments of shared misery where strangers treated each other like people. You talk, eat what little you had, watch the stars, listen for wolves, and drift off with the warmth of the fire and the comfort of not being alone. But far more often, you were on your own. No shelter, no firewood. Just darkness and the long whispering quiet of a world that didn't care if you slept. The wind pressed at your back. The ground stole your warmth. Every rustle and the brush made you tense. And you learned very quickly how to sleep lightly. You dreamed strange dreams of warm beds and soft pillows, of feather mattresses and clean sheets, of rooms with walls that kept out noise and rain. And then you'd wake to the cold slap of dawn and the realization that none of those things were yours. You stood. Your knees cracked. Your shoulders ached. You shook the insects from your sleeves, rubbed your eyes, and started walking again. Because the road didn't care that you hadn't slept. The road waited, and always stretched farther than you remembered. Money is always a problem. But on the medieval road, it is the problem. You need it for everything: food, shelter, transport, tolls, and yet you never seem to have enough. The silver coin you cling to like a sacred relic doesn't go far. The few pennies in your pouch rattle together in a way that sounds hopeful but feels humiliating. And still, everything costs. Sometimes openly. Sometimes secretly. But always you pay. And the worst part is, even if you do pay, they'll probably cheat you anyway. Let's begin with what you actually have in your pocket. Most travelers didn't carry sacks of gold. They had a handful of copper coins, maybe a few silver ones if they were lucky, and possibly a token from a local lord if they had connections. The coins weren't standard. A shilling in one town wasn't always recognized in the next. Every region minted its own, with kings, dukes, or ecclesiastical authorities stamped onto metal of wildly varying size and purity. If you tried to pay with the wrong kind of coin, the innkeeper would eye it, bite it, weigh it with greasy fingers, and finally say, "Not local. Worth half here, maybe less." You could argue, but it wouldn't matter. They held the bread. They had the key to the dry room. You just had a little disc of metal from somewhere they didn't care about. And if you didn't have coins, you'd have to barter. But what did you have worth trading? A patched up cloak? A spoon? A piece of hardened cheese you were saving for tomorrow? It didn't matter. Most people on the road had nothing. And the ones who had something didn't want what you had. You could offer labor sweep a stable, carry water, help chop wood. Sometimes they let you. Sometimes they said yes and then refused to feed you. Sometimes they just laughed. Now let's talk about the inns, which were supposed to be your one place of predictable commerce. At first, they seem welcoming. Warm fire, the smell of cooked meat. But the moment you step inside, the calculation begins. The innkeeper looks you over. Your clothes, your shoes, the state of your beard. They decide what you're worth before you open your mouth. If you ask for a bed, the price might be 1 penny or 5. If you ask for soup, it might come with bread or not. You'll never know until after you've eaten sometimes. They charge you to sit by the fire, and they don't list their prices. That's the scam. One traveler might pay a farthing. The next, a silver groat. It depends on who you are, how tired you look, and how desperate you seem. There is no menu. There is only power. And you do not have it. If you complain, they shrug. If you raise your voice, they throw you out. If you protest too loudly, they accuse you of theft. Some places even add imaginary charges. A cleaning fee for the straw bed. A spoon fee for the bowl they lent you. Heating charge for the shared fire. You leave poorer than you arrived, and with a knowing sense that you've just been robbed, politely. And then there are the tolls. You might think the road is free. It isn't. Almost every bridge, every crossing, every narrow pass between two hills belongs to someone. A lord, a bishop, a minor noble who calls himself Count of the Lower Ford. Even though his castle is falling apart and his only real power is a couple of wooden barricades and a man with a spear, they'll stop you, ask your name, where you're headed, what you're carrying. Then they'll tell you there's a fee to pass. Sometimes it's small, sometimes it's not. Sometimes they want coin. Sometimes bread. Sometimes a favor. If you refuse, they can seize your belongings, accuse you of trespassing, or just turn you around. And it doesn't matter if you paid a toll yesterday. That was someone else's bridge. Even religious sites weren't always free. You walk for weeks to reach a holy shrine. You enter the city tired, sore, and hopeful. But at the gate, there's a fee, a pilgrim's levy, a maintenance donation, a requirement to purchase a blessed token to prove your devotion. If you don't buy it, you're not allowed near the altar. No relics, no blessings. You walked 100 miles to stare at a closed door, but at least in towns, they might scam you with words. On the road, they do it with silence. You ask for directions. A friendly man in a muddy tunic points confidently to the left and says, "That'll take you straight there." You walk. 3 miles later, the road ends in a flooded marsh. No sign, no town, no hope. He knew, but he didn't care. Or worse, he did care. Maybe he sent you there on purpose. Other travelers aren't always honest either. They might walk with you for a while, laugh at your jokes, share their bread, and then in the night steal your pack. Or your boots. Or just disappear with the last of your water. Then there were the false guides, people who offered help for a price. They promised shortcuts, safe routes, secret roads. For a few pennies, they'd take you away from the danger, and they did into the deepest part of the woods, where their friends were waiting. You wake up bruised, barefoot, alone again. Marketplaces were no better. You walk into a town square, hoping to buy supplies. Bread, maybe dried meat, a new strap for your pack. But the merchant sees your road-worn face and raises his prices. Inflation. He says, "Rain ruined the harvest." He shows you a loaf the size of your fist and demands the price of 4. You haggle. He pretends not to understand your dialect. He shakes his head and turns away. And you leave hungry. Even priests sometimes. Scam travelers. Not all, of course. But some, they'd offer blessings for coin. Confessions with a surcharge. Your sin is great, they'd say, but not unforgivable. A donation to the church will help ease your path. And you give what you could, because what if it was true? And if you were poor enough, desperate enough, you might be tempted to steal an apple from a cart, a coin from a sleeping pilgrim, a bit of bread left unattended. You didn't plan it, but hunger is louder than morals, and the price? If caught, stocks, beatings, or worse, travelers weren't locals. You had no one to vouch for you, no family, no history. You were what they decided you were. And that was almost always a thief. Cruel irony of medieval travel was that you were always spending something. Money, strength, time, trust. And you always had too little of all of them, even when you did everything right. Even when you counted your coins, bartered politely, paid your tolls, shared your fire, you still lost. The scam wasn't just one person or one inn. It was the system, a world where the road cost more than you had, where being honest got you nothing, where being poor was not just an inconvenience, it was weakness everyone could smell, and yet you kept walking because there was no other way forward. You might imagine that the open road was free, that a traveler could go where they pleased, as long as they had the strength in their legs and the right direction in their heart. But medieval travel was not a simple matter of walking from one town to the next. It was a tangled, invisible web of rules, some written, most not, that determined where you could go. When you could go, and whether you'd be allowed to arrive at all, dot at the center of that web was bureaucracy. Not the neat, desk-filled kind, but the slow word-of-mouth, seal-stamped, Latin-muttered kind, where power rested in the hands of people who had titles like Viscount of Grain Inspection, or Deputy Bailiff of the Left Bank Toll Station. Titles that sounded small and petty until you needed them. And then they became the gates between you and everything else. If you were traveling for trade, you needed a permit. This wasn't just a matter of politeness, it was law. Goods moving from one town to another had to be declared. And in most places, you needed a writ or document to prove you weren't a smuggler. But who issued these writs? A local reeve, a merchant guild, a bishop's clerk. It varied. Sometimes the man with the wax seal was away for a week. Sometimes you'd lose your application unless you provided a gift. A coin, a goose, your only pair of boots. If you were caught without a writ, your cart could be seized, your goods confiscated. Your horse claimed by the local manor as compensation for your arrogance, you could protest. They would shrug. You were a traveler. You had no rights here. If you were a pilgrim, the rules were just as dense. The church encouraged pilgrimage, but it also wanted control. Many shrines required you to carry proof of your intent, a document from your parish priest, stamped or signed, sometimes with the name of the saint you sought. Some towns demanded these papers. At the gate. Others waited until you were within the church itself, then asked to see your credentials. If you didn't have them, you were a faker, a vagrant, a con artist pretending to be holy for free bread and shelter. Sometimes papers were forged, but badly. You could buy one from a man near the market who scribbled in Latin, but the seal would be wrong, the grammar would be off, and the monks could always tell, and you'd be expelled. Or punished, or simply laughed at and sent on your way with nothing but the shame of having failed bureaucracy with no appeal process. Even simple entry into a town required negotiation. City walls weren't just for show. At every gate stood guards or clerks, usually both asking questions. What's your name? Where are you from? Why are you here? Are you carrying goods? Do you have animals? Are you carrying any diseases? If you answered incorrectly or too slowly, you might be denied entry altogether. Towns feared outsiders, and rightly so. Travelers brought crime, they brought rumors, they brought plague. During outbreaks, entire villages closed their gates too. The world, notices were nailed to trees, no entrance, on pain of death. It didn't matter if you were healthy, you weren't from there. That was enough. If they did let you in, you might still be taxed. The entry toll varied from town to town. 1 copper for merchants, 2 for foreigners, half of those on church business. Children were free, but only if they walked. And every toll was recorded by a clerk who scratched notes onto a damp wooden slate or into a parchment book that hadn't been updated in 3 winters. If you wanted to sell something, the rules expanded again. Markets were not anarchic. They were organized by guilds, approved by lords, and watched over by officials known as inspectors, weighers, or sworn measurers. You had to pay for a stall. You had to swear that your goods were legal. You had to weigh your flour with an approved stone. Sell too much too fast. You were under suspicion. Sell something not local. You were cheating the economy. Even the church had its layers of travel bureaucracy. Visiting a shrine. Then kneel here, pay here, light a candle, there wait for the monk. To record your name in the pilgrim register. Want to sleep in the abbey's hospice. Not unless you've got proof of pilgrimage. Want a blessing? Stand in line. Wait. Donate. Wait more. Everything spiritual had a process, a hierarchy, and at least 3 men with robes and responsibilities who would glare at you. If you stepped out of line, worse still were the local lords. The road you walked on, it might pass through 3 or 4 different manors in a single day. Each lord, each steward, each sheriff had their own rules. In one village, you were expected to bow at the crossroads. In the next, you had to remove your hat near the manor house. In another, you weren't allowed to speak at all between sunset and dawn, unless spoken to first. If you broke a rule you didn't know existed, you could be fined, beaten, or detained. Detained for what? Disrespect. Suspicion of spying? Loitering. The charges didn't matter. What mattered was that they could detain you. And they often did. Some travelers carried letters of protection signed by noblemen, abbots, or merchants. These letters declared that the bearer was under the authority of someone powerful. It was a medieval passport. With one, you might avoid tolls, stay in monasteries, bypass bureaucratic inspections. But without one, you were just another. Nameless foot on the road. Even language became a barrier. Latin for the church, Norman French for the court, local dialects for the peasants. Every village spoke a slightly different version of the same language, and official documents were often unreadable to anyone but scribes. If you were questioned and couldn't explain yourself clearly, your silence could be mistaken for guilt. And if you dared try to appeal, if you said, "I have rights," or "I've done nothing wrong," you'd be met with blank stares. Rights were a concept, not a certainty. You had the rights others believed you had. And in unfamiliar towns, before unfamiliar lords, your rights were whatever the man with the seal and the sword decided they were. The paperwork of medieval travel wasn't made to help you. It was made to protect those in power. It was a barrier, not a bridge. It existed to slow you down, to test you, to catch you in contradictions, and it worked. And even if you survived the tolls, the permits, the guild fees, the gate taxes, the beggar licenses, and the clerical mumbling, there was still the final insult, the stamp fee. You handed over your document, your precious, hard-earned permit. They charged you again to stamp it, to make it official, as if the ink somehow transformed your life from illegal to allowed. And they looked you in the eye as they did it, daring you to object. But you didn't. You handed over the coin. You bowed. You waited, and then you were allowed to continue. You imagine that language is a bridge. That if you speak the same language, you'll be understood. But the deeper you walk into medieval Europe, the more that bridge crumbles beneath your feet. Because even if you technically speak the same language as the person in front of you, you still might not be speaking the same version. And even if you are, they might still refuse to understand you. And if they do understand you, they might just pretend they don't, because it's easier that way. This is the slow misery of a language on the road. Speaking and not being heard. Listening and not understanding. Repeating yourself over and over. Until you begin to doubt your own words. Let's begin with the basics. There was no such thing as standard English, standard French, or standard anything in the Middle Ages. Language wasn't taught in schools because most people didn't go to school. It wasn't unified by mass media because there wasn't any. What you spoke in one valley might be almost completely different from what they spoke just 2 towns over. Imagine you were born in 14th century Somerset, England. You grew up speaking a thick, earthy dialect of Middle English with hints of Old Norse and local slang. Then you travel east just a few days, and suddenly people are using different words for bread, for horse, for road, for you. Some of them speak Norman French. Others mixed Latin into their sentences, especially in towns. You ask for a meal and they blink. You ask for water and they frown. You try to explain your destination and someone starts laughing because you pronounced it like a child or a fool or a foreigner. If you're lucky, you can point and gesture. But even gestures can betray you. In some regions, a raised hand means peace. In others, it means stop. A shrug might be taken as insolence. A bowed head might be mistaken for mockery. Your silence might be interpreted as rudeness. Your accent as evidence of criminality. Because language was identity. The way you spoke revealed everything about you, where you were from, how educated you were, what class you belonged to, which village raised you. And on the road, that information could be dangerous. If you sounded foreign, people became suspicious. Where's this man from? They'd whisper, what does he want? If your words sounded too polished, they might think you were a clerk or a tax collector in disguise. If your words were too rough, you were a beggar, or worse, a robber. If your accent didn't match your face, your clothes, or your coin, someone might decide you were lying. And lying was a crime. Even within the same country, dialects diverged, like fractured rivers. England alone had dozens of variations. Northern, Midlands, West Saxon, all sprinkled with remnants of Viking words, French imports, and Celtic holdouts. If you crossed into Wales, you might hear nothing familiar at all. If you crossed into Scotland, you might hear Scots Gaelic, and you'd suddenly be the outsider, blinking dumbly while everyone around you carried on dot and if you were traveling. Outside your home country, the confusion multiplied. Imagine you are a pilgrim heading to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. You begin in England, hearing Middle English, then Norman French in the port towns. Then, once across the channel, the deep rural French of Brittany. Then Occitan, a musical southern dialect. Then Basque, which doesn't resemble anything you've ever heard. Then Galician. And all of this just to reach a church where the sermons are in Latin and the prayers are mumbled in a dozen tongues dot everywhere you go. You ask questions with your hands. You point. You mime. You hope. Sometimes it works. A kind merchant guesses your meaning. A boy runs off and returns with bread. But sometimes it doesn't. You say in, and they hear end. You say fire, and they think you want to fight. You say pilgrim, and they think you're offering to buy something. The misunderstandings were endless. You ask where the road leads, and they tell you how to cook lentils. You ask for help, and they give you a warning. You try to tell someone your name, and they misunderstand it as an insult. And the more flustered you get, the worse it becomes. Your words stumble. Your voice rises. Your gestures become frantic. They back away. You look suspicious now, and you are alone again. Even in towns, where you might hope for more cosmopolitan conversation, you still found barriers. Market traders used slang and abbreviations. Clerks spoke in legal jargon and Latin phrases. Priests often preferred Latin altogether, delivering sermons and blessings in a language you didn't fully understand, and then scolding you for misunderstanding them. The only people who truly spoke your dialect were at home. But home was far away. Now, in the cities, you might meet someone who pretended to understand you. They'd nod and smile, lead you down a street, offer you help, and then rob you, or sell you something you didn't want, or lead you into a part of town where no one even tried to pretend anymore, or you'd meet someone who spoke to many languages, a merchant who used Latin to impress the priests, French to flatter the nobles, and a dozen bits of local dialects to confuse the customers. You'd ask for directions, and he'd say something so fast, so fluid, and so contradictory, that by the end of it, you were somehow convinced to pay a toll, buy a pig, and leave town by a gate you hadn't even noticed before. Sometimes you thought you understood. You hear a familiar word, a phrase you recognized. Relief would fill you like warm water. Finally, you could rest. But then they'd add one word too many, change the context slightly, or use a tone that flipped the entire sentence upside down. You'd nod, pretending to still understand, and wander off in the exact wrong direction. Dot, and then there's Latin. Dot. It was the language of the church, of scholars, of bureaucracy. It was everywhere in documents, signs, inscriptions, blessings. You saw it carved into doorways, written on altars, etched into gravestones. But it wasn't spoken like living language. It was recited, chanted, intoned. It was designed to be heard, but not fully understood. It was meant to awe and uninform. You might carry a document in Latin, a permit, a blessing, a writ of passage. But if you couldn't read it, and most travelers couldn't then, it was just a piece of parchment that strangers squinted at, muttered over, and finally dismissed as fake or expired or simply unworthy. Language was not your tool. It was your trap. It whispered to you in voices you almost recognized. It lured you into believing you could communicate. It teased you with half-understood words and false confidence. And when it mattered most, when you needed help, safety, or trusted abandoned you. So you spoke less. You learned to keep your questions short, to gesture with care, to avoid unnecessary conversations. You watched for signs instead of words, a raised eyebrow, a closed door, a pointed staff. You began to live in the quiet between dialects, walking with your thoughts and your silence, hoping the road itself would eventually lead you somewhere that sounded like home. But it never quite did, because no matter where you went, everyone spoke just slightly wrong. And by the end of your journey. So, did you got? It's not a cheerful question, but it's a practical one. Because in the Middle Ages, the road was long, dangerous, and indifferent. People died on it, often, quietly, suddenly, and usually alone. And when that happened, the question wasn't why, but what next? What happened if you died on the road? The answer mostly was not much. There were no emergency services, no search parties, no official registry to mark you as missing, no one to notify your family. There wasn't even a reliable way to identify you unless you happened to carry a letter or wore a known symbol from a guild, a monastery, or a noble house. But most travelers carried nothing so helpful. Just cloaks, pouches, and the vague scent of places far away. If you fell and died in a ditch, it might be days before anyone found you. And when they did, they didn't know your story. Maybe they guessed. They'd see your worn boots and your empty flask, the bruises on your limbs, the pack still clutched to your chest or spilled open beside you. Maybe they thought you'd been robbed or had a fever or simply collapsed from exhaustion. But more likely, they didn't wonder at all. Because this wasn't unusual. Dead travelers were part of the road. Sometimes they were left where they fell. The countryside was wide and thinly populated. If a body was found in the woods, on the moor, by the edge of a field, it might simply be buried nearby, in the shallowest possible way. Not because of cruelty, but because of necessity. Digging a grave took time and effort and tools. You did what you could with what you had. A few stones, a bit of soil, maybe a prayer. If you were lucky, but you weren't always lucky. Bodies were sometimes ignored, especially during times of plague or famine. People feared contamination. They feared trouble. They didn't want to be accused of murder or theft just because they were near a corpse, so they kept walking, averting their eyes, pretending they hadn't seen anything, and if the body lay near a village, the locals had a choice to make. They might report it to the reeve or the priest. They might take your few belongings to be safe, they'd say. They might gather a group and decide whether or not to dig a grave at the edge of the field, or burn the body, or leave it for the animals. There was no uniform response, just a series of small, quiet decisions made by people who had no idea who you were. If you were near a monastery, you had better odds. Monks took the burial of the dead seriously. They might take your body in, wash it, lay it in a spare crypta on a stone floor until a grave could be prepared. They might chant the proper prayers, sprinkle holy water, record your passing in a dusty book that no one ever read. But even, they needed a reason. If you died of disease or appeared suspicious, they might turn you away. And in the end, you would still be buried without a name, no tombstone. No marker, just another small mound of earth. a shallow hollow at the edge of. A hill, a space beneath a hedge where wildflowers would later grow, and slowly, over weeks or months, your name would fade. From memory, from speech, from the road itself, because there was no central record. No one tracked travelers. No lists, no maps with dots showing where someone was last seen. If you left home and never returned, your family might wait, might hope, might pray. But eventually, they'd stop talking about you. Life went on. Fields had to be plowed, livestock fed. Grief was a luxury few peasants could afford for long. And what of your possessions? They didn't go to next of kin. They went to the person who found you, or whoever got there first. A cloak, a knife, a purse with 2 pennies, a crumpled letter, a worn sandal. It was all fair game. There was no inheritance law on the open road. The law of the land didn't reach into ditches and brambles. What was yours became someone else's. What mattered was that it didn't go to waste. If you were murdered, there might be more ceremony or suspicion. The body might be dragged to a town, shown to the constable or reeve, an inquiry held. But only if you were someone worth investigating. A merchant, a noble's courier, a known figure. If you were just a ragged traveler with no name and no allies, the most they might do was scrawl something in a village ledger. Unknown man, dead by river, possibly robbed. And then nothing. The road moved on, and if your body was left alone, truly alone, nature reclaimed it. Foxes, crows, wild dogs, insects, rain. The earth softened beneath you. Leaves covered your bones. You became a part of the very road you had walked, and after a few seasons, no one could even tell you'd been there, unless a traveler stopped, felt a strange presence, noticed a smooth hollow in the grass, and wondered briefly who had lain there. But they wouldn't dwell on it because they were walking, and they knew, somewhere in their bones, that the road didn't care. Even churches where records were sometimes kept could only help if you made it there before death, if you died. Near a shrine, and someone brought your body in, and the priest decided you were a pilgrim and not a criminal, then maybe your name would be carved in a wall. Maybe you'd be given a candle, a small wooden cross with your initials. Maybe, but mostly, death on the road was a pause, not a punctuation. The road didn't stop for it. It curled around it, swallowed it, smoothed it over with dust and time. Your journey ended, but the road went on, and on, and on. So, what happened if you died on the road? You were missed, then forgotten, buried, or left. Prayed for, or ignored. And your story, whatever it was, ended in a place with no witnesses. Just a hedgerow, a creek, a patch of cold earth that knew your footsteps and then took you in. And eventually, someone else would walk by, tired, lost, clutching a crust of bread, wondering how much farther they had to go, and they wouldn't see you. But the road would remember, because it always does. In the Middle Ages was everywhere, not just in buildings, but in the air and the habits and the fears. From the moment you were born, someone said a prayer over you. When you washed, when you ate, when you coughed, when you married, when you died, there was a prayer for that. And when you traveled, the church wasn't just part of the landscape. It was a gatekeeper, because while you walked the roads with blisters and doubts, the church stood along the way with crosses and conditions, with candles and consequences. And sometimes, without even meaning to, you wandered into a situation where your fate wasn't up to you anymore, it was up to the church. Let's begin with this simple fact. You couldn't travel without being watched. There were churches in every village, monasteries dotting the countryside, shrines on hillsides, priests at bridges, bishops in cities, deacons on the road. And everywhere, someone watching, someone listening, someone judging. If you were a pilgrim, you were one of them, sort of. There were expectations that you behave, that you dress modestly, that you carry the right tokens or letters proving your devotion, that you'd bow at the right places, whisper the right words, avoid meat on Fridays, avoid sin at all times, but that was difficult when you were starving, or sick, or tired, or desperate, and the church knew this. That's why they gave themselves permission to intervene. If a monk saw you behaving improperly, begging, eating meat on a fast day, quarreling in a holy place, he could report you to the local abbot who might summon you for correction. You might be denied shelter, or food, or blessings, or be publicly rebuked before other travelers. Your status as a pilgrim could be revoked, informally, but powerfully, and you would be cast out. Not from one monastery, but from all of them. Word traveled, slowly, but it traveled. A monk in one town might write to a prior in another. Watch for this man, he offends God, or worse, he lies. Because lying was a sin, but lying to a priest, that was a threat. If you claimed to be a pilgrim and weren't, that was fraud against the church. If you claimed to carry holy items and couldn't prove it, that was heresy adjacent. If you said you'd been blessed and hadn't, you might be accused of profaning the sacraments. And while it didn't always lead to prison or torture, it could lead to being shunned. Shunning was simple. No one fed you. No one helped you. People crossed themselves when you passed. They whispered, unclean. They refused to speak your name. You were spiritually dangerous, and they let you feel it with cold shoulders and closed doors. But it could go further. You might be summoned before an ecclesiastical court. These were held in back rooms, chapels, monastic offices with wax-stained desks and scrolls no one had dusted in months. The priest sat in judgment. He might ask questions. He might not. If you were accused of blasphemy, or lechery, or possessing, forbidden books, or speaking against the saint, even just once, your fate hung on whether the priest believed your apology. And apologies had to be exact, humble, tearful. You had to confess not only that you were wrong, but that you had always been wrong, and that the church was always right. You had to beg, kiss a cross, sometimes even whip yourself in front of others to show remorse. Otherwise, you might be excommunicated. A terrifying word that meant, in essence, you no longer exist in the eyes of God. It wasn't a death sentence, but it felt like one die. It meant no priest would bury you if you died. No monk would bless you. No nun would offer you a crust of bread. No church would let you through its doors. You were a body on a road, a spirit without a tether. You could still walk, still breathe, but your soul was declared off dash limits. Sometimes this sentence was reversed. You'd find a friendly monk, a sympathetic abbot. You'd confess again, give up your shoes, take a vow of silence, pray for 7 days straight in the shadow of a crumbling shrine. And maybe the sentence would be lifted. You'd be allowed back into the fold. But other times, you weren't. And even if you weren't excommunicated, you still faced the problem of moral suspicion everywhere you went. The church had moral expectations, and travelers were constantly failing them. If you cursed in public, sin. If you touched a woman's hand, sin. And if you entered a tavern on a fast day, sin. If you forgot to cross yourself before eating, sin. If you had strange dreams, or heard voices, or quoted the wrong scripture, suspicion of heresy. And heresy in the wrong place at the wrong time was a serious matter. Not always torture, not always burning, but always judgment, always fear, and sometimes even execution, especially if you traveled from far away. If your accent was strange, if your clothes were odd, if your face didn't match your dialect, you became a question mark in the margins of the church's book. And question marks weren't welcomed, and then there were the obligations. The church didn't just monitor your behavior, it taxed it. Tithes, pilgrim offerings, donations to relics, candle money, mass fees. If you passed a famous shrine, it was expected you'd leave something. If you didn't, the monks might confront you, quietly at first, then firmly. Have you no reverence? They'd say, would you cheat God's own house? And if you still refused, they might record your name or your face, or simply tell the next town you were godless, because reputation followed you. The church, more than any other force, could shape how others saw you. They couldn't jail you, not directly, but they could ruin you, mark you, haunt you. You'd arrive in a new place and find people already suspicious, already closing their shutters, already waiting for you to slip up, and yet the church thought you needed its shelter, its bread, its hospitals, its safe passage. The road without it was colder, hungrier, shorter, because the church, for all its judgment, was the one institution that still recognized your soul, even if only to threaten it dot, so you obeyed. Most of the time, you muttered prayers you didn't understand. You kissed crosses without thinking. You bowed to statues. You dropped coins into baskets. You nodded at sermons in Latin. You performed a performance of faith that made you blend in just enough dot because, in the end, when you were far from home, half-starved, sore-footed, uncertain where you'd sleep, and terrified of dying unnamed in a ditch, the one place still open to you at midnight, with a flickering candle and a hard bench, was the church, and whether or not it would save you depended entirely on how well you had played by its rules dot after days, weeks, maybe months. After aching feet, bruised ribs, missing boots, and half-rotten food, you finally arrive, the town, the city, the shrine, the port, the place you've been mumbling toward in 100 broken dialects across 100 miles of broken road. You've survived highwaymen and tolls, false guides and false priests, the heat, the hunger, the stench, the confusion. You're tired. But you made it, and then it hits you. This is it. You expected something more dot because, after all that, it should mean something. It should look different, feel different, smell like relief. But your destination, like most destinations in the medieval world, is not a reward. It's just another place that doesn't care about you. Let's say you were headed to a pilgrimage site, a holy city, a shrine. You imagine candles, choirs, open arms. But instead, you arrive to a gate manned by a guard who doesn't speak your language. He eyes you like you've already stolen something. He gestures. You don't understand. Then he points to a box with a coin slot. Entry tax. Again. You pay, or maybe you don't. If you don't, you're told to leave. If you do, you shuffle through the gate into a city choked with other pilgrims who also thought this would be different. Dusty roads, too many feet, too many hands. 1,000 different cloaks pressed together like livestock in a pen. Every step is slow. Every corner is crowded. You queue for hours to get to the shrine. When you reach it, a monk waves you past before you can finish your prayer. You try to touch the relic, but someone shouts, "Not allowed. Keep moving. No lingering." Number? Kneeling. Just shuffle past the bones of a saint under dirty glass and move along like you're in line for spoiled bread. If you're lucky, you get a token, a small badge or charm. A crude carving of a cross or a shell. Proof, they say. Proof you came. Proof you were here. It jingles when you walk. It catches on your tunic, but it doesn't feel like a blessing. It feels like a receipt. And what about food? You thought it would be better here. That towns with holy sites would have warm meals and kindness. But the inns are full. The bread is hard. The soup costs more than you have. The pilgrims outnumber the beds. You sleep in the dirt near the chapel wall, surrounded by strangers snoring. Under sacks and dogs sniffing for crumbs dot, and the shrine isn't even clean. The steps are slick with wax and mud. The air smells of sweat and damp wool. The stone walls echo with coughs. No miracles, no voices from heaven, just murmurs and silence. You leave feeling the same as when you arrived, only poorer, only sore. Maybe you weren't a pilgrim. Maybe you came to a city to find work, or family, or a better life. But cities in the Middle Ages are not places of arrival. They are machines built to grind strangers down. First, you have to find your way in. There are multiple gates. Some are locked at dusk. Some cost coin. Some require you to state your name, your purpose, your trade. If you say, "I don't know," they may turn you away. If you look poor, they may send you to the labor district or to the stables. If you look too well dressed, they may suspect you're a thief. Once inside, the smell hits you, even worse than the road. Waste in the gutters, animal dung on the stones, meat rotting in stalls, a perfume of humanity in its most compact and least washed form. You try to find someone, a cousin, a patron, a name you were given weeks ago by a man who swore they'd help you. But they're not here, or they're dead, or they never existed. You ask around, people shrug, or ignore you, or point the wrong way just to get you out of their market stall. You sleep in an alley. Rats nibble at your sack. You clutch your shoes to your chest. In the morning, they're gone anyway. You try to find work, but you don't have a guild badge. You don't know the laws of this place. The laborers hate outsiders. The merchants laugh at your accent. You get hired for half a day to carry bricks, and they pay you with a piece of black bread and a nod. No coin, no promises, and you are not the only one. There are hundreds of you, travelers, pilgrims, vagabonds, people with nowhere to go and no idea what to do when they get there. You wander the city like a ghost among thousands. You see others sleeping in the same clothes, coughing in the corners, clutching tiny bowls of stew and chewing as slowly as possible to make the warmth last. Maybe you try the church, a monastery, a shelter. You ask for food, they give you broth. You ask for work, they tell you to come back in a month. You ask for help, they hand you a prayer and close the door, and even if you do find what you were looking for, family, fortune, redemption, it never feels like enough. The brother you traveled to see, he's older now, tired, suspicious of your sudden appearance. He lets you stay for 2 nights, then asks you to leave. I have a family now, he says. I can't afford another mouth. The master who promised you a position, he forgot, or he lied, or he's dead. You wait outside his shop for 3 days before someone tells you it burned down the saint you traveled to see. They're buried beneath a stone altar. But the monks won't let you close enough to even whisper your confession. The city you imagined is not the city. You arrive in it's smaller, colder, more indifferent. The walls are too close. The roofs are crooked. The water is cloudy. The people look through you. And when you finally sit down and realize you're exactly where you're trying to be for so long, you still feel lost because the medieval world was never built for comfort. It didn't care where you came from. It didn't reward effort. It didn't save its warmth for those who suffered longest. You survived the journey, yes, but the destination? It was never a prize dive. It was just another stop in a life made of stops. You rest for a night, maybe 2. Then you ask yourself, should I return home? But the way back is longer than it was coming. You're older now, hungrier, and your home may not be home anymore. You've been gone too long. You've changed. Or they have dots so you stay, or drift. Or leave again because the road is cruel. But at least the road made sense. The destination only ever promised something it never meant to give. You came all this way. You endured cold, hunger, sickness, confusion. You were lied to. You were robbed. You slept beside ditches and under shrines. And then, after everything, the destination disappointed you. It was smaller, crueler, more indifferent than you imagined. There was no miracle. No welcome. Just more walls, more tolls, more people looking past you and say you do the one thing harder than writing. You turn around, going home in the Middle Ages wasn't just a return journey. It was a second beginning. But this time, the excitement was gone. There was no goal, no vision, no holy relic waiting at the end. Just a vague direction, back, and the long, muddy, dangerous stretch that now had to be walked again, with less energy, fewer supplies, and more doubts. You leave the city behind. The gate closes. The road opens in front of you. And it's worse now. Not physically, though that too, but emotionally, spiritually. You've already seen this road. Stepped on this stone, slept behind that barn. But now there's no hope in the steps. Just echoes. You remember everything that went wrong the first time? And now you're walking back through your own failure. There are no songs this time. When you left, maybe you sang a little? Or at least you mumbled prayers. You had a rhythm in your step. You believed things would improve. But now the air's quieter. Even the wind sounds tired. Your bag is lighter, not because it's better packed, but because you've lost things. A second pair of socks, a knife, that small pouch of dried apples. Gone, taken, forgotten your shoes are thinner. Your legs ache in places that didn't ache before. Your coin purse holds a few clinking regrets. Not enough to buy much. Too much to throw away. You ration it, uncertain if it will last, if it even matters, and the towns along the road remember you, some for good reasons. A monk nods. A farmer waves. You slept in their barn. You didn't steal, you were quiet, but others look at you with narrowed eyes. They remember you differently. A beggar. A nuisance. A stranger who asked too many questions. One who left without paying, or one who smelled of fever. The doors don't open as easily this time. The welcome is colder, and the road itself seems longer, because when you first traveled it, you walked with wonder. You notice things. A carved stone, a flowering tree, a strange shrine in the shape of a goat. But now, every landmark is a reminder of how little it helped. That beautiful arch. It offered no shade. That old priest, he sent you the wrong way. That bridge, you nearly drowned under it. Thought there were new dangers too. On the way out, you were one of many travelers. A tide moving toward the shrine, the city, the feast. But now you're walking against the tide. Fewer people. Fewer fellow wanderers. The road is emptier, and with that emptiness comes risk. Bandits know who's headed home. They know the signs. The limp, the sunken eyes, the slow gait of someone with nothing left to lose. And they target that dot if they take your last coin. What will you do? No one lends money to the returning poor. No one feeds a pilgrim who has already failed. You try to pray, but even your prayers feel backward. Help me get home, you whisper, but your voice cracks. You're not sure if home wants you anymore, because home has changed. Or maybe you imagine the village, your cottage, your mother's hearth, but you've been gone a long time. Crops have come and gone. Babies born, people buried. If they remember you, they might not be glad to see you. If they don't remember you, that's worse. You worry your place has been taken. Maybe someone else rents your room. Maybe your siblings sold the tools. Maybe the field you once worked is now tangled with weeds or has a new master entirely. The past isn't frozen. It's moved on without you. And you're not sure you can move back into it, so you walk slower. Not just because you're tired, but because you're uncertain. Every mile brings you closer to a version of life that might not exist anymore. You prepare your stories. The road was hard. I reached the shrine. I did what I could. But these words won't fill empty pantries, or explain where you've been during the worst of the harvest, or justify why you returned with nothing. And if you were gone long enough, years, even, there's a chance no one even believes you. They think you fled, think you found work somewhere else, think you became a criminal. He didn't return when his brother died, they'll whisper. He left just before the plague. Must have known. Suspicion follows the returning traveler like a shadow dot, so you practice smiling, you try to walk taller, but your legs shake, your back aches, and your mind drifts to a question you never thought to ask before. Was it better not to leave? There's no good answer. You left because you had to, or because you believed, or because someone told you it would change everything. Maybe you regret it. Maybe you don't, but either way, the damage is done. You are not who you were. And the road does not give refunds. Eventually you see familiar trees. A river, A stone wall you helped build. You crest a hill and see it, your village, the roof lines. The smoke. The place that used to be home. You step closer. A child stares. A dog barks. Someone shuts a door. No one runs to greet you. There are no garlands. No feasts. Just a new season. A new rhythm. A few quiet stares and maybe a cautious nod. If someone offers you bread, you take it. If they don't, you pretend you're not hungry. You sleep in the corner of the barn. Just for tonight, you say. Just until you find your place again. But you already know you'll never quite find it. Because when you return from a journey like this, you carry it with you. The dust never leaves your clothes. The ache never leaves your bones. The silence of the road lingers in your voice. And even as you sit in a place that once felt like safety, you're already thinking, what now? Because in a world like this, muddy, uncertain, fragile, going home was never the end. It was just another beginning you didn't ask for. Today. We speak of travel as escape, adventure, leisure, a chance to see the world. But in the Middle Ages, those words would have made little sense. To see the world was not a luxury. It was a burden. A thing that happened to you, or because of you, or in spite of your wishes. Travel was something you endured, and only if you had to, because no one traveled for fun. Not peasants, not nobles, not even monks or knights. Because travel was not relaxing. It was not pleasant. It was not designed to be enjoyed. It was dangerous, dirty, expensive, confusing, lonely, and at times utterly pointless. Most people lived and died within 5 to 10 miles of where they were born. Not because they were imprisoned, not officially, but because the world outside that range was unpredictable. To leave your village was to lose your bearings, your rights, your protections, your connections, even your language. And that meant, by default, risk.travel, when it happened for only a few reasons. You were going to work? That might mean harvest labor at a neighboring estate, or being sent away as an apprentice, bound to a master in another town for years, or being pressed into service, carting grain to a market half a county away. Work. Travel was not optional. You went where you were told. And when the job was done, you came home poorer than you expected and sorer than you thought possible. You were going to war, which, in the most literal sense, meant you were likely going to die somewhere unfamiliar. Young men were summoned, marched, shoved into formations, and sent across borders. Most of them didn't know where they were. They didn't see the countryside. They saw mud, horses, screaming. And when it was over, if they lived, they walked home with broken teeth and broken memories. And maybe a new limp. You were going to pray. Pilgrimage, one of the only types of long-distance travel available. To the poor, the church said it cleansed your soul. But in reality, it emptied your coin purse, strained your feet, and left you vulnerable to every possible misfortune between home and shrine. You weren't sightseeing. You were bargaining with heaven, one step, one prayer, one blister at a time. You were going to die. Famine, war, plague, eviction. These uprooted people constantly. Entire villages wandered after bad harvests. Survivors of war trickled into cities looking for scraps. Outlaws fled justice. The sick were sent away. Widows begged. Orphans drifted. None of these people were travelers. They were displaced. And no one wrote stories about their scenic views because, again, no one traveled for pleasure. Let's say you were rich. A noble. Surely you traveled. Not really. You relocated, but not lightly. Every journey took planning. Carts, guards, letters of passage, food stores. And even then you risked disease, theft, embarrassment. Your carriage might break. Your horses might fall ill. You might offend a lord whose lands you passed through. Even the highborn feared the road. Many sent emissaries instead. As for merchants, yes, they traveled. But their journeys were not joyrides. They were calculated, risky. Investments. You might lose everything. Your cargo, your coin, your health. You might drown at sea or freeze on a mountain pass. You might spend months away only to return with nothing but a new tax bill. It was business, not leisure. And often, it barely broke even. What about curiosity? You didn't travel to learn new cultures. You weren't welcome. You didn't understand the language. The locals didn't want to explain their customs. They wanted you gone. You didn't gaze at monuments or try new food. You avoided unfamiliar buildings in case they were cursed or sacred or guarded by people with clubs. You ate what you brought. You drank what you could find. You left before sunset. Even walking itself was grim. There were no sidewalks, no maps, no rest stops. You walked in shoes not made for distance, through mud, over rocks, across rivers with no bridges, through forests with no paths. You followed ruts and rumors. You looked at the sun and guessed the direction. If it rained, you were wet. If it was cold, you shivered. If it was hot, you sweated through every layer of wool. There was no dry comfort, no shelter by default. Only what you negotiated, or begged for Dot and the people you met on the road. Not companions. Dot other travelers were competition, or danger, or just as lost as you were. The better dressed ones passed you without eye contact. The rougher ones asked too many questions. The desperate ones followed too closely. Sometimes you made temporary alliances. Let's walk together until the river. But by the river, they were gone. Or you were. There was no camaraderie. No shared playlist. Just trudging. You didn't bring souvenirs, maybe a handful of foreign coins, a broken token, a piece of cloth, a story you couldn't tell properly because no one at home believed it. Did you really see a town where people eat snails? They'd ask, and you'd say, yes, but only on Thursdays. And they'd laugh, and you'd realize you had no proof. Just sore knees and a strange cough you picked up somewhere outside Rouen. Even returning home didn't feel like an ending. It felt like another mistake. Because people had moved on, changed, forgotten you, and you changed too. You'd been sick in new ways, seen things you didn't want to describe, learned things you couldn't explain. You were a stranger again, not to the road, but now to your own village. The only people who found meaning in travel were saints. And they were usually dead before anyone declared it meaningful. Sometimes, centuries later, a monk wrote it down. She journeyed for 7 years through strange lands, barefoot, eating only roots. But she hadn't traveled for fun. She'd fled, she'd punished herself, or she'd been exiled. The journey was her suffering, her transformation, her cross. The idea that travel could be a reward, a delight, a vacation, that was unthinkable. It would be like suggesting. Someone moved to the next village for the joy of hauling their life through a storm, or that they starve for the pleasure of complaining about different kinds of hunger, or that they let a strange man sleep in their barn for fun. Travel in the Middle Ages was a test. And even if you passed it, no one clapped. They just looked at you and asked, why'd you leave? So most people didn't. They stayed put. They built lives within hedgerows and hills. They whispered stories of faraway places but didn't go to them because they knew something we often forget today. The world is wide, but the road is cruel. And no one, not even the most curious, wants to walk into cruelty without a reason.